Hello, my name's Mary. I'm an artist living in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with a particular interest in the esoteric. Today I want to take a look at an enigmatic but very influential British occult artist known as Austin Osman Spare. I first came across Spare in the early 90s through a couple of bands who were influenced by him, Coil and my favourite band Fields of the Nephilim, who even have an album named after Spare's first publication, Earth Inferno. At the time here in New Zealand, much like in most of the world, we had no home internet access. In fact, I don't think I was even aware of the internet at all until around 1994, when the Central Library allowed members to come book time slots on their single connected computer. When I could, I'd go into the library and look up music I liked. I think the first non-musical search I did was for Austin Osman Spare. There was also little ability to get unusual books from overseas. But while I was at university, I had a part-time job in a boutique bookstore which gave me access to their catalogues, and I was able to order in occult books. But sadly, there was nothing available from Spare. Once interest grew in his work, so too did facsimiles and retrospectives, which I was able to buy many years later when I was in London. I'll show you a few of my favourites at the end so you can think further about what you might like to read. I'm very aware of how volatile conversation can be around occult topics. I'm not a Spare scholar, just someone who appreciates his work, so please be assured that this is all my personal take on Spare rather than a definitive guide. Feel free to leave me comments if the mood should take you. When looking at the work of Austin Osman Spare, you'll probably notice that it's so varied in style, it's amazing that it all came from the same artist. From detailed blackline drawing to fluid watercolour to occult instructional pieces and to the rather grotesque caricatures of borough denizens, his distinctive personality is undeniable in all of his creations. In his early artistic life, Spare would have been exposed to the many interesting creative currents that were moving through Edwardian Britain, with Eastern mysticism finding a home next to Western occultism, theosophy, spiritualism and new advances in scientific thinking, such as Darwin's theory of evolution. All these ideas shaped Spare's thinking, his theories and practices, both those he chose to express in his creative output as much as those he chose to reject. I'm only going to be able to skim over some aspects of his life and work, so I will let his general history and life story go in order to concentrate on art and the occult, as those are my favourite topics and I imagine they're yours too. Spare was born in 1886 in Snow Hill, east of central London, to a working-class family, later moving to Smithfields and across the Thames to Kennington. His family were not impoverished by any means, but they certainly weren't wealthy. He showed early artistic talent and won a scholarship to study at the Royal College of Art when he was 13, with a growing reputation of being a young prodigy and likely to take the whole art world by storm. He was influenced by various artistic movements such as Symbolism and Art Nouveau. As he grew into adulthood, these movements were falling out of favour in the art world, much like any art movement that becomes seen as old or stale to be replaced by new thinking. Spare was a flamboyant and handsome young man with an eccentric streak even in his youth. Combined with his out-of-fashion artistic interests and spiritual leanings, he didn't fit in well with the academic establishment and ended up leaving art school to pursue his own ideas. Here he is as a young man, well presented, the picture of an artist at his easel. And now here he is as an old man, living in poverty, surrounded by the stray cats he loved and cared for. This is a portrait of Spare in middle age and a self-portrait from around the same time. Spare is often lionised as the classic outsider artist living in poverty in the South London district of Borough with nothing to his name save his artworks and his cats. But this version of Spare didn't manifest until his later years. Plus, he was never an outsider from the art world. In Spare's youth, his social circle comprised creative thinkers, writers, poets and artists, many of whom were of a social class above Spare's own. This meant he was moving in wealthier circles and, through his friends, renting living quarters in better parts of London. It seems that he might have felt out of place among his new friends, and maybe he felt more at home among the poor and found inspiration in the lives and characters of the people around him when he moved to South London. His early work was remarkable for its classical understanding of form and the technical prowess and its draftsmanship, initially creating very beautiful figurative drawings that could have been done by one of the old masters. He later moved towards a style of black line drawing which was likely influenced by Art Nouveau luminary Aubrey Beardsley. But as he experimented with style, he never relinquished the classic training which stood him in excellent stead no matter what he chose to do. Of course, the most notable aspect of his work is the influence the occult played upon it, with his art and magical system being inextricably entwined. For Spare, art and magic developed together, and it was through art that he was able to express his magical ideas. His was a primal magic based upon obsession and ecstasy, with none of the trappings of ceremonial occultism and none of the niceties of polite society. Having met famous occultist Aleister Crowley in the early 1920s, Spare was introduced to ceremonial magic, which he ended up rejecting to develop his own very personal spiritual system. Spare was initially friendly with Crowley, but became highly critical of him later in life for unknown reasons. Well, we do know that he felt Crowley's esoteric practices were full of pointless theatrics, and that he thought Crowley behaved too outlandishly. Crowley, in contrast, continued to hold Spare in high regard, although feared that he had become too inward-focused and had fallen off the path to divine realization through his narcissistic, obsessive practices. It's important at this point to note that Spare may have comprehended the terms self, obsession, and narcissism differently in regards to his magical practice. But personally, I can't help wondering if Crowley wasn't entirely wrong. But who knows, it certainly seems to have worked for Spare. Much later in 1949, after he had moved to Borough, Spare was befriended by Kenneth and Steffi Grant, both accomplished occultists who also had close links to Crowley. The Grants had their own ideas around magical practice and were immediately impressed by Spare, taking the older, rather impoverished man under their wing. This was a pivotal time for Spare because the Grants were able to promote and preserve his work in a way that Spare was not wont to do himself. After initially being part of Crowley's Ordo Templi Orientis as a young man and working as the elderly Crowley's secretary, Kenneth Grant started to move in new directions. These were pretty far removed from Crowley or indeed anything else seen in Western occultism at the time. Grant's work took on a distinctly extraterrestrial flavour that involved a magical current emanating from another planet. He became interested in exploring the reverse dark side of the Kabbalistic tree of life, while also incorporating author H.P. Lovecraft's interdimensional monstrosities into his magical pantheon, believing the fiction writer was in fact tapping into something important. I think there is a distinct change in Spare's output around the time that the Grants began helping him with his writing and the exhibition of his works. You can see the influence of Kenneth Grant particularly in the naming of Spare's artworks, which I'll talk about a bit later. The Grants took note of all Spare stories, many of which were enthusiastically retold by Kenneth Grant, who appears to have taken them all on board without the slightest skepticism. There may be elements of these tales that are exaggerated or fabricated by Spare to retroactively fit his own narrative. He paints himself as a voracious lover from a young age, with a sexual appetite that encompasses women of all ages and levels of attractiveness. Most notable is the legendary Mrs. Patterson, or the Witch Patterson as Grant describes her, an old woman practicing witchcraft who could turn herself into a nubile young girl to seduce the young Spare for sex magic purposes and induct him onto the path he would follow for the rest of his life. There isn't any real historical evidence of a Witch Patterson or even of an older woman seducing the young Spare. For all Spare's stories of lifelong debauchery, it's not clear whether he was sexually active with that many human women or whether his multitude of partners were on the astral plane, so to speak. Although Spare's system of magic may at first glance appear very different from that which Crowley and other occultists were engaging at the time, like with any mystical esoteric practice, it's coming at the same goal from a different angle. How successful it is, I think, depends on the practitioner, and a system like that developed by Spare is really very particular to him, although it certainly influenced the Grants and played a significant role in the later development of chaos magic. His thinking is at the same time both stripped back and deceptively complex. More than anything, it is difficult to articulate succinctly, but I'll try to do my best. The main drive for Spare was to unite what he called Zos, the fleshly body, with Kia, the primal void and wellspring of all existence. I believe the reason is very much the same as any mystical magician, to apprehend primal creativity, a union with the void, dissolution in the infinite, in a word, to touch the divine. He has a number of methods to do this, but the one I will elaborate upon is called the death posture. I especially love this instructional illustration. This image is from his 1913 publication, The Book of Pleasure, Self-Love, which also showcases his beautiful line work. Spare used a form of sigil making in which words of desire are distilled into letters, then the letters turn into a geometric aggregation or glyph, which then helps to solidify the desire in the subconscious of the practitioner without the conscious apprehension of the desire getting in the way. The sigil becomes a graphical representation of one's desire rather than a blatant written intention. In the Book of Pleasure, Spare states, "Sigils are the means of guiding and uniting the partially free belief with an organic desire. Sigils are monograms of thought for the government of energy related to karma, a mathematical means of symbolizing desire and giving it form that has the virtue of preventing any thought and association on that particular desire escaping detection of the ego, so that it does not restrain or attach such desire to its own transitory images, memories and worries, but allows it free passage to the subconsciousness." He also uses here a selection of characters from his alphabet of desire, which he created as a form of living or sentient symbol. On the bottom right is the description, the whole body becoming a cart in the posture, which suggests he might be alluding to the astral body talked of in ancient Egyptian religion. The unity of will, desire and belief creates the state allowing access to the Kia, which Spare describes as small belief. We might consciously think this is unenergetic and unvital with no power, but great belief, springing from the unconscious, is a vital force of eternal desire commanded by will. An interesting side note is the similarity between the naming of Spare's death posture and the yogic Shavasana or corpse pose. Shavasana is a supine posture of complete surrender, often practiced at the end of a series of asana when the physical body is exhausted. Spare's posture seems to go past that state to a further level of exhaustion and release. He describes gazing into a mirror until his perception of his own self was blurred, then closing his eyes and looking inward. He clasps his hands behind his back and, stretching upwards, hyperventilates until he falls into a swoon. There are some more links to the yogic practice here: the adoption of a twisted and locked posture, or a yogic bandha, and the panting pranayama that perhaps resembles Kapalabhati or the bellows breath. Of course, Spare's interest in the magical potential of sex is likely to come into play here as well. He spoke often and openly about his enthusiasm for the pleasure obtained through self-love in both the mystical and masturbatory sense, so his death posture could undoubtedly be achieved through orgasm. He does also state that it can be anything that facilitates an exhaustive swoon, even something like extended ecstatic laughter. I love the image on the far right of the body in the death posture. It showcases Spare's artistic ability by brilliantly articulating the utter exhaustion of the body falling as a boneless form. Spare described his experience of uniting Zos with Kia through the obsession of self by saying, "A mystic is one who experiences more of himself than he can articulate." I think that this is an illuminating statement. It suggests his pure self being opened, unfolded, and then dissolved in the primal void. His lower self is given up to his higher self, which can then perhaps tap into the limitless creativity abundant in the Kia. It's also important to note again that this idea of self is not related to ego. Self is not in Spare's case selfish, as we might understand the word. This unbridled creativity that Spare tapped into led to some confusion in the early 20th century art world. One critic stated of an exhibition of work in 1911, "Of Mr. Osmond Spare's drawings in the end room, it is difficult to speak without dragging in questions which are beyond the range of legitimate art criticism." Blake's most fantastic inventions are sane, normal and bourgeois beside these irresponsible wanderings of an overheated imagination. But then, he goes on to say, every scribble of his pencil is informed with style, and the penwork of the highly finished The Psychology of Ecstasy is a marvel of incisive clearness, crispness, suppleness and richness. To find the equal of its line, one has to fall back upon Dürer's etchings. Contemporary art critics had no idea where to place him. His technical ability was impressive, but his subject matter baffled and horrified them. Here are two images which are worth looking at that showcase the combining of his classical style of draftsmanship with sigils, geometric diagrams and the warping of figurative form. I found it challenging to get correct titles and dates for all these works. In general, you can tell when a work may have been created by the artistic style, and likewise the titles often give a clue. Spare generally had little initial interest in titles, most works being called things like nude torso or portrait, but after Grant became involved, the artworks took on far more Baroque names. For example, the drawing on the left from around 1920 bears the title Nude, and the one on the right, which is from later in his life, is apparently called Aerial Vampire. I don't believe that Spare would have picked that later title earlier in his career. These are quite different images from later in his life that I particularly like. They depict unsettling alien landscapes. On the left is the pastel work Astral Body and Ghost from 1946, and on the right, Traverser of the Eons, Ego from 1955. Spare experimented with artistic style throughout his life. A body of work that I had initially dismissed as being somehow too pretty has come back to be one of my favourite eras of his practice. These are portraits of beautiful women he either knew or had seen in the movies. He collectively called these Experiments in Relativity on the Principle of Space Bending. Great title. In the image here we see a work entitled Green Sidereal. In the centre, actresses Joan Crawford and Mary Pickford, and then on the far right his friend Steffi Grant. Sidereal means astral or of the stars, but Spare used it to mean something more unreal or seen from an unusual sideways angle. The subjects are the stars themselves, Hollywood icons living on a different plane in another shifting world. Years ago, when I first saw one of these images, I actually thought that the publisher had squashed it to fit it on the page. A concept called the new sexuality sprung out of Spare's ideas around libidinous energy as a creative force. It appears that this sexuality was a melding of the self with the whole of life, possibly without the need for an ordinary sexual partner, in order to manifest a kind of oceanic oneness with existence. He speaks of a state known as the neither-neither, a liminal place of being not one thing or the other, not the Zos or the Kia, not the conscious or the subconscious. Becoming curious about evolution, which was fairly new to the public sphere, Spare was especially fascinated with the way, over long periods of time, one creature could evolve into another. He was fascinated to find that we as humans could have other creatures in our evolutionary tree, but Spare took this a step further, and he imagined that the ancestors available to us as humans could be drawn from other evolutionary trees, and they could be recalled from our unconscious. To Spare, evolution was not a passive process that occurred over millennia by exposure to environment. It was a process that could be willed and instigated to the force of libidinous desire. This concept, which he named atavistic resurgence, became a core part of his practice. In his book of automatic writing, Anathema of Zos, he made this amazing statement. Fools, ye have made vital the belief that ego is eternal, fulfilling a purpose now lost to you. All things become of desire. The legs to the fish, the wings to the reptile. Thus was your soul begotten. Hear, O vermin, man has willed man. I hope this was an interesting short look at Austin Osman Spare, his thinking and his artwork. I'm going to show you a few books from my library and give a brief explanation of each and what you might enjoy about them. His books tend to go in and out of print, with most being limited runs, so it's hard to know what's available at any given time. These first three are facsimiles of his contemporary publications, published by Mandrake Press. Earth Inferno was created when Spare was only 18 and is the first introduction to his concept of Zos and Keir. This was also my first introduction to the idea of Osmond Spare through the Fields of the Nephilim album. It showcases the aesthetic influences that Aubrey Beardsley and Charles Ricketts had on his artistic output at the time. Anathema of Zos is an automatic writing which showcases Spare's belief system and contains the quote I referenced at the end of the main part of this talk, explaining the impact of atavistic resurgence on the subconscious through the power of desire. While much focus is rightly put on Spare's artistic works, his written pieces are just as interesting and give insight into why his visual work exists. This publication, Automatic Drawing, I think will be of particular interest to artists and those who want to try this practice. It has many fascinating examples of his automatic pieces, but most interesting to me are his essays on the method of this practice. He is very generous in his explanations, which will allow you to properly give automatic drawing a go. This biography by Phil Baker is the best I've found as far as research into the factual reality of the Spare legacy, while also honouring his magical practice. I feel that this is quite impressive. It would be easy for a historical biographer to focus on fact and logic to the detriment of those things which are more ephemeral and were of most importance to Spare. A very good book which you'll definitely be able to get hold of, and I believe it looks like there is a revised and expanded edition available now. Images and Oracles of Osmond Spare. This is written by Kenneth Grant. Because of his close friendship with Spare and his own deep relationship with the occult, this gives a unique look into the stories and legends surrounding this fascinating man. And by this fascinating man, I actually mean both Spare and Grant. Grant had a tremendous collection of Spare's artwork, which is dazzlingly reproduced in this beautiful book. He also delves into all the craziest and most intriguing Spare lore. So a really amazing piece of Spare history, as well as a wonderful insight into Kenneth Grant. Burra Sata is another book from Folger which takes a different angle. It's a collection of essays and recollections from Spare's contemporaries. I especially enjoyed the piece from Steffi Grant, which gives a tender look into Spare the man through the lens of a friend rather than an admirer or a detractor. It's very humanising. So these are my favourite Spare related books that I have, and I hope this encourages you to take a deeper dive into the work of this fascinating artist.